Breakfast with Bob.
Welcome everybody to Breakfast with Bob. My name is Bob Babbitt. We're brought to you by the PTO, the Professional Triathletes Organization, by Amp Human, VeloFix, Normatec, Form Goggles, UCAN, and our Challenged Athletes Foundation. In March, we sent out 3,921 grants totaling $5.9 million to keep challenged athletes in the game of life through sport. We've now raised over $112 million and sent out over 26,000 grants. Our next guest, only one of my favorite people on the planet. He is, two-time Ironman world champion, 1997 ITU world champion, five-time Ironman Australia champion, four-time Challenge Roth champion, four-time Alcatraz, Wildflower champion. I don't know what I forgot, but his name is Chris McCormack. Macca, how the heck you doing?
Very well, Bob. Good morning from Australia, from lockdown in Australia. We're not so locked down anymore, but it's I haven't been in Australia at this time of year for, I think, 25 years. So very different.
For someone who travels as much as you, this must be crazy time that you just can't go anywhere.
I struggled for I'll be honest, I struggled for the first month thinking, always need to do something. I'm chronically ADD. So I think, but I've actually sort of settled into this, to enjoying the slower pace. I must admit, I'm catching up with family and friends I haven't really found the time to do in the past because I've been busy, and
Yes.
And I've enjoyed it. But I'm starting to get to that point now where I'd like to escape this Australian winter and get back up to Europe and enjoy riding in the Alps and just watching some triathlon events and just being part of the community that we've been involved with for so many years.
And speaking of that, going back to the day you were an accountant. You're in your office, you got a good paycheck coming in, you're overlooking the Sydney Opera House and the Bay Bridge, and life is good, but you weren't a happy guy.
I wasn't. No, that seems like a lifetime ago. But yeah, that was in the early 90s. I finished college and took a job at Bankers Trust, which was a big a bank here in Australia, and I was an accountant. And that was basically the job my father had planned for me since I was a kid. And I was the furthest thing from happy. I was fortunate enough to grow up in the same area as Greg Welsh and McKeely Jones. So as a youngster, being able to have access to these two superstar triathletes in a sport that I was actually enjoyed following was sort of, they were living the life I wanted to lead. And so I ultimately quit that job and pursued a career in triathlon that everybody said would be the biggest regret of my life. And I proved them all wrong, which was fantastic. It was the greatest period of my life. I loved it. It was better than I anticipated.
Well, that was the pattern. The pattern was that, when you went in and told your boss, listen, I'm leaving. I think he was probably thinking you got a better job or you're looking for a raise. And when you told him you wanted to be a professional triathlete, what was his response?
He laughed in my face. That was exactly what I actually went in there and told him I was quitting the job, and he'd been a fantastic supporter of everything I was doing. I appreciated him employing me. I'd only been in the job for 8 months. So, his first thought was I moving to another firm? And I said, no, I want to be a professional triathlete like Greg Welsh, who was a household name in our country. And he laughed. He said, you're a dreamer, kid. Best of luck. And instead of giving me 2 weeks notice, you can finish today if you like. And that was it. It was my last day at work. And literally 6 weeks later, I was sold everything I owned in Australia, and I was on a plane to Europe in 95 and commencing my professional triathlon racing career.
But the hard part was your whole life was education, right? Family was education, and get that good job. You've got it all. And now you've got to tell dad that I've quit this good job because I'm going to make a living being a professional triathlete. How hard was that?
That was the biggest fear of all. And I've told this story a lot, and you know it very well, Bob. But I love to paint the picture of my father because he's not an ogre, right? And I sometimes hear myself, a lovely, amazing dad. He's incredible. And but he grew up without an education, and he was determined. He had 3 boys, and he was determined we would have one. And he threw his whole life into that. And my older brother's a lawyer, my younger brother's a computer engineer, and I was the accountant, and to go to him to pursue a career in a sport which in the 80s and 90s was emerging. It wasn't the established, well-known sport that it is today. It'd be like, with the utmost respect, telling your father you want to be a professional Spartan racer.
I was going to say exactly that.
It's very, very, it looked very different back then. And And that was difficult. And I told him, it took me a couple of weeks to tell him I quit my job, and he used to pick me up a couple of times a week on his way to work so we could spend some time together. I wasn't living with him at the time, and I'd already quit the job, and I used to get dressed in my suit and get in the car with Dad. He would drop me at the front of my office, which I was no longer working at, because I didn't have the courage to tell him that I'd quit this job yet and was going to pursue a professional racing career in Europe. And after 2 weeks, I went to a family dinner and dropped the bombshell, and he took it much better than I anticipated. But I just think it was the fear of, and now I'm a father, the fear of disappointing him, because I knew what it meant to Dad for us to all graduate university and to get a job, and it had been drilled into us for so long. I just didn't want to disappoint him, and I don't think I did. I definitely felt a level of, oh wow, that's a big shock, and he gave me some advice, basically like, look, if you're going to do this, then don't treat it properly. Treat it, it's a profession. It's not I don't want you to have a 10-year gap year, if that makes sense. I want this to be do this properly and pursue it with your heart and your mind, and I wish you all the best. And that's sort of, I think when I left Australian shores, and I had that always in the back of my head, there was an element of Dad always in the back of my head, driving every decision I made and driving every performance I ever made to prove to him as much that this decision was a worthy one. And this was the right path for me to take at that time in my life.
So when you're in Australia, it's not like you can just walk around a corner or drive over and go to these world-class events. At that point, you went to the States or you went to Europe. And you're basically committing to months away from your home.
Yeah. You're selling everything. And that's probably the one thing I realized very, very quickly when I got to Europe was, I booked this ticket. I hadn't really given much thought to what it looked like to be a professional athlete. Back then we had the magazines, and you live vicariously through the pictures in these magazines, and they look magnificent. And I know we've spoken before about watching Ironman Hawaii on television, this beautiful 1 hour, 2 hour documentary piece with fantastic music. And it just life looks marvelous. So as a youngster, your whole drive is just to get over there and be a part of it. You don't really think of the logistical plan in between leaving and being there, and what happens in all those days that go by while you're over there. So when I landed in Europe, I'd sold everything I had. I had $2,500 in my bank account, an open-ended ticket. And I realized I'm 12,000 miles from home. I have to make this work. And you grow up very, very quickly, where I don't think the Europeans, or to some degree the Americans, where you have the luxury of having this racing series within your own backyard and you can always return to your home base, appreciate that was a major driving factor of the success of Australian athletes at that time within this sport back then, because we'd gone so far to be a part of it that you were committed and you couldn't go home, and you had to work, and you had to push yourself through those times of being homesick, and you needed to win that race because that extra $500 meant you ate for another week, and that hardness was amazing. And now you've got all these professional, high performance structures all over the world. So the youngsters, I don't think, have that same sort of drive. It's a much more globalized and connected community now. But back then it was 100% a driving factor of my early success in my European racing.
Well, because you'd be racing in France and then take an all-night train to get to Switzerland for the next day to race there and hopefully make 2 paychecks in the same weekend.
I couldn't tell you how many times I raced Saturday and Sunday. That was just common racing for me. It was, exactly. I'd race in Gap in southeastern France in the Alps, and then be on a train and straight up to Switzerland racing the Credit Suisse event Saturday, Sunday. Hopefully the race director would give you a night's accommodation so you could stay until Monday and then go back to a training base and then look for races in the magazines that happened the following Saturday and Sunday. And lucky on sometimes you may get a Friday evening race somewhere because a lot of the racing in Europe was always done in the afternoon, which I did like. And sometimes you could get 3 races over a weekend. I look back now at some of my old training diaries and see and you read, it used to all be written back before the computers. And I was only reading it probably 6 or 7 months ago about some of these amazing weekends I did where it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday of racing. And I lost count on how many times that was part of just the racing scene back then. And that sort of built this hardness that enabled you to be very resilient on the world tour as that started to open up, and really made you able to travel, because a lot of athletes are very good at training from home, take them out of their home environment, they struggle in those training camps, where Australians seem to be very resilient in that sense, because we're already out of home and we're already an expat in another land, and we already have to make our tentacles and our bases in those lands, and we become strong in that sense, and we become real racers.
So I think one of the first times we met was not long after you won the 97 Worlds. And in that, when going to the 97 Worlds, everybody would have voted Simon Lessing. This is the most dominant guy on the planet. And I just love the way you trained with him leading into that race so that you knew how to beat him. Talk a little bit about what it took to beat that guy, because there's a pattern there. Simon Lessing, Norman Stadler, Craig Alexander, throughout your career, you sort of realize who I got to beat and how do I need to do it.
Yeah, Simon Lessing in my career is the greatest athlete I raced, with the utmost respect to my other peers, but he had my measure physically, I believed, at that point in my career. He had my measure mentally. He had the runs on the board. He was a multiple world champion. He was a superstar, and he was part of my club in France. And Simon had an innate way of being the alpha male at all times, and making sure he kept you in your place. And I realized when I was in France that you needed to be, tread carefully with Simon. He was delicate in the sense that you could annoy him. He was the alpha male. And I thought, look, I need to put myself around this guy as much as possible and find out how to beat this guy, because at the moment he's a better swimmer than me. I can probably match him on the bike, and most of the runs he's outrunning me. And he came to Australia to prepare for the World Championships. He was very good friends with Macca Jones and Pete Coulson at the time. So he came down and stayed with them for about 2 months prior to World Championships. We had a Sydney World Cup race. We had a Sydney World Cup, another event in Newcastle, and then the World Championships. And I was fortunate enough to train with him. And that was when I guess he let me in a little bit because of McKeely and Pete. And I realized there was a vulnerability there that could be exploited if I could attack him out on the run, which no one had done before, and stay with him close and attack the run and put him under duress to some degree. There may be an opportunity to beat him. And that's sort of the tactic I went into World Championships with, to run Simon Lessing off his feet, which, had you said that back then, people would have laughed in your face. But that was the tactic I employed, and I got off the bike with him and roared out a transition with that tactic in place.
And when you win that, how did that change things for you in terms of now you're world champion? Did all of a sudden more sponsors come on board?
For me, it was, I guess commercially, yes, things definitely changed. I arrived to some degree, but for me, it was a relief personally to show mum and dad that this is what I did. It was, I'd been away for 2 years, and I always pictured my mum and dad at their dinner parties, because I'd been the young child in the background listening to those adult conversations. And I was always worried that their friends may say, "Oh, what's Christopher doing?" He's doing spa. Yeah.
He's in a Speedo in
he's
Europe.
in a Speedo somewhere. Yeah, exactly. where by coming home and being world number one and having such a dominant year, and even the year prior, I was, top 8 in the world, but that 97 year, having a dominant year, and knowing that World Championships was in Australia, mum and dad could be a part of that, winning that World Championships on the build-up, on the cusp of triathlon making its Olympic debut in Sydney, my hometown, only 3 years later. The momentum of it all, especially here in Australia, just gave solace to myself. That I remember vividly saying to my dad, right as I crossed the line, the first thing I said to Dad was, "This is what I do, Dad." I could just see him beaming. And it was just the acceptance of father and son that I'd made that right decision, and it was full speed ahead to the Olympics. But from a sponsorship perspective, it was life changing. It was, you suddenly arrived, all this talent you talked about, you'd basically put a stamp on the fact that you're not a prospect or a talent, you actually are a champion now. I always say to the young kids now, if they're talking about you as a prospect, it means you haven't won anything. When they start talking to you as a champion, that's when your life changes. So that World Championships changed me from being this prodigy to a champion athlete, and with that comes the commercial changes and the responsibility.
Yes,
responsibility of leading your sport, and the responsibility of realizing that you as an individual haven't changed. And yes, you may have won one race, but just because you're world champion doesn't mean that you're invincible now from that point on. And that's the great lesson that you learn in sport, that not so much humility, that vulnerability, is only one race away, right? And just because I beat Simon Lessing at the World Championship doesn't mean he turns up to the next race petrified of me. He turns up to the next race wanting to beat me up, and that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did.
Did you ever hear from your boss from the accounting firm?
I did, and he came. We had a really, really big party at my parents' house. You know, all my running friends and running club, and I brought my old boss, and he did a speech at that party, and he tells a very different story to the reality of me fronting in that day to quit. He's like, "Oh, look, we always believed in Chris as an athlete, and you know, we really supported that move, and it was fun." But Brian's his name, and I'm still to this day. He's a little old. He's actually retiring soon, but a little older than I am. But I'm still to this day friends with Brian.
I love it. So then you come to the States, and in '98, I think what I always looked at as one of your bigger wins. You're at Alcatraz, Greg Welch, right? The guy you were reading about, seeing in the magazines. It's like you and Welchie, right? At Alcatraz. And that was that your first US win?
That was my first race, triathlon race in the USA. Yeah, it was Alcatraz 1998. I just signed a bicycle deal with GT.
Yeah.
I moved from a European bike company called Principia to GT, and I had to go out and meet with all of them. I met Jim Felt back then, and with McKinley and Pete. And Alcatraz at that point in time, as you know, was a really, really big race. There was sort of two televised events, Hawaii and Alcatraz. And with GT, they were like, "Look, you need to come out here and race Alcatraz. You need to be a part of this event. You need to win it." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I flew back and competed there with, with Greg Welch, who was, still, it's quite funny. I was 23 years of age. I'm world champion, but Greg Welch is still your idol. It doesn't change because you win a world title. You're still a young kid. Now I'm older. I can look back and think, wow, I was so young. But even though I've got the world championship bands, to me, I've watched every single race of Greg Welch's. So trying to shift that racing mindset into the thing that, okay, I'm the alpha male now. I need to be the alpha male. I got to not be the hero worshipping Greg Welch. I need to take this guy out. He might be and because he'd beaten me up more than, at that point in my career, Greg had beaten me way more than I'd ever beaten Greg Welch. So that was a big event. And I do remember the pep talk that Pete Coulson and McKeely had with me the morning of the event, saying, "Look, you need to win this race. This is your next world championship." And so I treated it as such. And we ran together, Greg and I, and it was a sprint to the finish to win my first Alcatraz title.
So now you're 2 years away from the Olympics. And like you said, Sydney, hometown, you're ranked number 3 in the world, I think, that year, right? And you don't get selected for the team. Yeah,
it was.
I like to bring up all the good memories.
We're going to have a positive conversation today.
That actually turned out to be one of the greatest things ever. That lit a fire, right?
It was. I'd had a fantastic 98. I'd retained my world number 1 status all through 98, all through 99, and my mum fell sick in 99, and so I took the season, 4 or 5 months of the season off. I came home when my mum fell sick, and then she passed away, and then I spent 4 months with my family. So I dropped down the world rankings, and I probably, looking back now, took too much time off in 99. So I obviously created a little bit of concern with the Australian selectors that maybe I wasn't in the right headspace to compete. And then when they opted to select the team, they left both myself and Greg Bennett, who were the 2 highest ranked Australians, off the team. And it sort of, I was shocked because if you go back to 99, Greg Welch had sort of had a heart issue, so he dropped out. He was definitely one of the guys that was vying for selection. He'd won the Sydney World Cup the year prior and beat myself and Craig Walton. And so when he was out, Brad Bevan. So for me, Brad was sort of with
declining
the
a little bit.
To Brad, he's sort of plateauing. He didn't have the same fear amongst us young Australians. At the time, it was really Craig Walton was a concern, Miles Stewart was a concern, Greg Bennett was a big concern. There was other athletes like Chris Hill, Peter Robertson. They were sort of coming on. And Greg, when he dropped out, I thought it was a foregone conclusion. The team was going to be the 2 Sydney boys, Greg Bennett and myself, and potentially a Miles Stewart. And it just didn't go that way. They picked Peter Robinson, who deserved his spot and went on to prove that he was a worthy champion of the sport. And they picked Craig Walton because they believed that the big aggressive swims of Simon Lessing and the French needed to be nullified by someone like Craig Walton, and they left myself and Benno off, and I was mortified. I was very disappointed, but as you said, I considered retiring then. I'd literally lost my mum 6 months earlier, and now I wasn't on the Olympics. I just thought this beautiful fair.
I didn't realize you were. Oh, wow.
Yeah, this whole fairy tale of my life that I'd sort of planned out in my head, that I was going to do this and win the World Championships. Then I was going to win the Sydney Olympics for my mother 7 months after her death. Then I was going to go and win Hawaii. And this is sort of how you write your list out, your life plan. And it just didn't happen that way. But at that point, I was down. I was considering retiring, and I'd met my wife, Emma. And it was McKeely Jones that said, hey, snap out of it. This is sport. You know, like you've been in it as a professional for 4 years. You're a world champion, and you've had one setback. You're 26 years of age. Like, come to America. Like, come and race in the States. And I went and lived with Pete McKeely in San Diego, and was part of McKeely Jones' preparation for that Sydney Olympics, which was, to me, one of the highlights of my career and my life was being such a geek and a fan of Olympic racing as a former runner, and knowing someone like McKeely Jones, who was going to the Olympic Games with a legitimate chance of winning a gold medal. To me, gold medalists were like Sebastian Coe and these mythical creatures, right? To be part of an Olympic campaign with McKeely, and to see her race at those Sydney Games and miss it by that much, it was magnificent. And that really harvested and, I guess, fostered my love back for the racing. And I realized this was the racing I read about, the Chicagos, the Alcatrazes, the San Diegos, all these events that I'd read about for years, and now I could be a part of. And it really, you know, I fell back in love with the sport and thought the US is going to be my new home. And I made the US home for 13 years.
You dominated racing. And then, now when you went to challenge Roth, was that really like your first long distance race?
My first Ironman, so what basically happened was after 2000, I had that great year in America, and I won a couple of World Cups, but the rumblings within the triathlon, my peers, and there's always the gossip and the rumblings, was Macca's winning everything because all the good guys are preparing for the Olympics.
Right.
That was sort of the whole talk. And it used to rub me the wrong way, because, you know, I'd beat Miles, or I'd beat Craig, or I'd beat the Australian team, or I'd beat someone, and they go, oh yeah, but I'm in build phase for the Olympics. You're not in the Olympics, so you can be. And so for me, 2001 I was all in. I'm like, right, Olympics is off. I'm racing you guys everywhere I can get the chance. And 2001 for me was probably my most successful short course season, one of my most successful seasons. And I won 3 World Cups that year. I retook the world #1 ranking. I won the Goodwill Games.
Yep.
I probably should have won the Worlds. I crashed on the bike. I was a minute off the front in Edmonton. And yeah, it was as much a proving point to all my peers that, hey, I haven't gone anywhere. In fact, I'm better than what I was, and you guys are dead. And what sort of happened after that was, after winning the Goodwill Games and being world #1, the Federation came back to me and said, look, I know you're living in the US. Why don't you come back and prepare for Athens with us? Jump back into the fold, come back and prepare for Athens. And
let us hose you again.
Yeah. And I was like, look, I'm on this rampage. I found a really nice niche in San Diego and California. I found a great training group. I've got, you know, I'm very happy there. I'm racing better than ever. If you allow me to do my thing, and I can come in and out of the training structure, which is now normal, right? This is what kids nowadays, you can now do that. Back then, you're either in the system or you're out. And they basically said, look, you know, you need to come back and commit to the system or you're out. And I said, well, if you won't allow me to do it my way, then I'm going to be out. And a guy called Bill Davrin, who was running the high performance program at that point, said, what are you going to do, Macca, Ironman? Like, you have to come back. I know you want to win the Olympics. You have to come back. And let's face it, you're too big to be an Ironman. You know, they had all my numbers.
That's all you needed to hear.
Yeah, they had all my numbers, and everything said that I could only do short course. And so I literally entered Ironman Australia.
That's
I had
right.
that conversation at the end of 2001, and entered Ironman Australia 2002 for an April race. And you know, it was Peter Reid, there was Stadler, there was Olivia Berner. It was stacked. Back then, there was like 10 or 12 Ironmans in the year. So every Ironman, and you had to qualify by being top 3 in an Ironman to get to Kona back then. So most Ironmans were relatively stacked. And I ended up winning that run on debut, which was the first time an Aussie had won in 12 years. So, and that was the beginning of the Ironman scene for me, which, you know, reflectively, I look back on they were probably right. I probably should have stayed in ITU racing until I was at least 30, which would have got me to Athens, and then I could have gone across and done Ironman. But once you start down that Ironman path and you experience it and taste it, and you've been a geek for it, like I was, it's a very difficult drug to walk away from, Ironman racing. It was beautiful, and I absolutely hated it while I was racing it, but absolutely loved that finish line.
Yeah,
200 meters down that finish chute. The endorphins that hit you are just remarkable, and that was the hook that kept me in Ironman racing. And that ultimately, I went to Roth because when I was growing up, Roth was Ironman Europe.
Yes, it was.
And Norman
Lothar Leder.
Lothar Leder had won it. All the guys.
Top 8.
Hellriegel had won it. Yeah. So for me, it was always, you know, going there and experiencing these Ironman races. And I ultimately did Zofingen, which doesn't exist anymore. Not many people know that. I actually went and did a training camp and was living in Zofingen and ran this big duathlon over there as a training day.
Big money.
If you're up the front, but those Swiss were really, really good at that stuff. Very, very hilly racing.
and swim.
Yeah, but for me, it was about doing the events,
right?
That inspired me. That mattered, yeah. That mattered at that time. They're not so much. They don't matter so much anymore. At that time, they were massive.
So five wins in Australia. After you won in 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then when you go to challenge Roth for the first time, and I just love that battle with you and Lothar, just because, right? It's Challenge Roth, and it's 250,000 people on the course, and it's the great field. Talk a little bit about, because you and Lothar were basically doing a Mark Allen, Dave Scott all day.
Yeah, it was. I was very new to Ironman racing. As you said, I had done Ironman Australia. I'd won it 2 years in a row now, and what made me commit to Roth in 2003 was the hosing I got at Ironman Hawaii in 2002. Right, so I'd won Ironman Australia on debut. I just figured I was going to win Kona that year, and we laughed because I think you were in the car with Dave and Mark when I was off the front, and I turned to them and said, "When does this get hard?"
Yeah. And also, I was there when we were on stage, and I said, "So you think you can win?" I think I can win 6 times.
Yeah.
Dave Scott's in the audience, and he goes, "Why don't you win 1?"
Yeah. Oh man. It's cringeworthy now, but I just never realized, like I've told you this, that when you watch the television coverage and the beautiful music kicks in, it looks magnificent, and until you experience the pain on those lava fields, there is no Ironman like it. And for me, I had a 13-minute lead that year. It was Jürgen and Thomas and I got off the bike together. Jürgen couldn't run out of the tent. We just killed each other on the bike. And Thomas Hellriegel was just such a warrior. Like, he just kept moving forward. Ended up 4th that day, and I ended up walking DNFing and got crucified for not finishing the race. So there was a lesson learned there that I hadn't really appreciated what it meant to be an Ironman athlete at that point in my career. Coming from short course, it's just another race, right? I never realized the emotion and the commitment that everyone does to be an Ironman athlete. So when I stepped off, I got hammered. Right. By everyone, you quit, you're a quitter. And I was quite taken back by that. So I went, okay, never again. So I went back to Ironman Australia, I won, and I decided to commit to a European Ironman to race the Hellriegels and these guys who I believed were going to win Kona, even though at that time Tim de Boom and Peter Reed, there. I believe that European arm was coming again and coming strongly. So I went to Roth and had all those guys, and I was expecting a very similar race to the Ironman Australia and Ironman Hawaii, where it's semi-controlled. There's sort of an element of, okay, this is Ironman, you take your time, and it's a patience game. But Roth blew my doors off. These guys, the swim, I was comfortable in the swim. I led out the swim with Stephen Sheldrake, and I had about 3 or 4 minutes on the Germans at that time, and a couple of French guys. Thomas that year had a problem halfway through the bike and was out. He had a bike mechanic problem, but he drove this group, which included Lothar Leder, Francois Chabot, and Alex Talbot, all these guys to the front and I remember being on my bike riding we only had speedos back then. You didn't have like odometers. You didn't have SRM cranks. And I was sitting there going, right, I'm riding 45K an hour, which is 30 miles an hour.
Yeah.
They're not going to catch me. And I'm losing time. And I'm thinking, I don't ride Olympic distance races this quick, and that was the big shock, was just how aggressive the Europeans raced Ironman.
Yeah.
They were just aggressive races. And Lothar caught me, and we had a few things fell our way with Thomas having a problem. And then it was myself and Shabod and Lothar. Lothar attacked on the climb, and we were able to distance ourselves. And then it just became a match race. And the whole run, I just thought, I'm going to stick with Lothar later. I'm a world champion at short course, and I'm going to out sprint this guy. So he has to drop me. And the closer I got to the finish, the more in my head I thought, I'm going to beat the king, and I'm going to win Roth, and Ironman Europe is now. I got that title, tick that off the list. Myself and Sean, my best friend, had written as kids. And we came into the stadium with about 400 meters to go. There was hundreds of thousands of people. And Lothar sort of took the inside line just through I guess, experience on the course, which made me run wide on this little turn, which would be insignificant in any other race. But at the end of an Ironman, when you feel like you're sprinting, but you're running 6-minute miles at the best, if you've got an inside run and it's 3 meters, you don't have the momentum in your run to close 3 meters very, very quickly. And what I found was like the gap opened, and I watched it open, and I went, okay, run up onto Lothar. And I just couldn't do it. And I realized very, very quickly that to win an Ironman, strength at the end of an Ironman is what wins a sprint. And Lothar was just way too strong, and it just stayed that 3 seconds distance for the last quarter mile. And he won his fourth title in Roth, and I was relegated to finishing second, and was quite shocked because I guess I counted my chickens before they hatched, and it seemed to be a common thread in my early career.
Well, but you got 4 titles there, and the cool part was I love the fact that there was a point there on the run where you are running all out, and Lothar said something like, "This next part might get pretty fast."
Yeah. Well, he said that on the bike too. The first part, when they caught me just before the Solaraberg, which is this a mile climb that's just shrouded with people. There's just hundreds of thousands of people, and we're about a mile out before this climb, and Lothar came up on me. I thought he was coming to take a turn. And this is just to the utmost respect I have for the guy. He's like, look, Chris, you're about to come into the coolest part of any course in triathlon anywhere in the world. Just control your emotions, because it's very difficult. A lot of guys get over the top of the Solaraberg and then blow up because it's just a very emotive thing. So many people. And I turned this corner and I just looked up and saw this sea of people. I was like, man, this is like the Tour de France. And it was a real buzz. And he let me lead over the top of that. And, the camera pulled up. I said, that was unbelievable. And he did the same on the run. We came through the far end of the course, which they called the beer mile. And it was a mile-long section of beer tents that the Germans just drank beer all day and got rowdy. It was unreal. And he said, this section's going to get really, really fast. And we're running like sub 6-minute miles. I'm thinking, all right, can't get any quicker than this, Lothar. Yeah, but it was, fun times. And very different, because you didn't have, we didn't, nowadays they have the professional, you have your area where you put your own drinks and your own, but back then you fed off the course. So if you weren't concentrating and you did push too hard, you had to rely on the, unless you're carrying the fuel belt and stuff, the aid station. So a lot of the times in those races, especially in Roth in those early years, and full credit to the athletes that came before us, the crowds were so big that a lot of those aid stations you missed because there was just people everywhere, and you're like, oh, that's an aid station. So it was great to have Lothar there to basically be I guess I was the apprentice and he was the leader, and he sort of walked me through that first year, which enabled me to set up 4 great years after that.
So Kona, DNF that first year, you walked the second year, the third year, DNF again.
I retired the third year.
The third year retired. I remember you getting in the car, right? And there's a guy who had broken his bike in half, and he was had in socks carrying his bike, and he was going to walk the last 8 miles. He's like, hey, Macca, what's going on? And you felt like about 2 inches tall, knowing that you had dropped out. But then the following year, and because you're a bigger guy, nutrition and the heat was going to be a problem, right, in Kona. And you had done all this testing with your nutrition guys on, what to eat, what to drink, stay away from Coca-Cola. And that year in 2005, you're out on the bike course suffering, right?
Yeah.
And thinking, this is it. And Hellriegel comes by, and what's he say?
I done, you know, Thomas Hellriegel was the first athlete I ever saw use an SRM. You know, I talk to Jan and that a lot about it nowadays. I said, but back then we didn't have power meters. So Ironman nowadays is even though they're going a lot quicker, and it's a very controlled race in the sense that that they're able to ride their power.
Right.
So we didn't have that. So you know, you would feel like you're in control, but nutrition, you ran out of nutrition very, very rapidly. So, or because you'd overcook things, which they don't tend to do as much anymore because you can keep yourself within those ranges. So I remember having suffered so many years, I went down to the Australian Institute of Sport and went, this is it. There's something wrong with me. You know, I jumped in the car with Mark Allen the year prior, who told me I needed to be fat in July, and I raced too much and I needed to sort out my nutrition and understand how my body reacts in heat. So I went down to the Australian Institute of Sport, did this full heat chamber training, worked out my sweat rates, exactly how much sodium I needed to take, exactly how many calories per hour I burn at certain heart rates. It wasn't so much power back then. And I thought I was coming into Kona with the answer. I'm like, it can't be my physicality. It has to be this nutrition thing they're all talking about and the heat thing. And I still recall to this day that the people at the Australian Institute of Sport said, stay away from simple sugars, multidextrin only, no Coke, nothing like that. The simple sugars are going to you're not going to react to them. So I'm drinking this concoction that they'd made for me the whole race, and I felt terrible, like the worst swim of my career. That year, the bike, I was throwing up the whole way. But constantly following this routine that they'd set for me, or this perfect plan they'd set. And I was going up towards Harvey. I was the furthest I'd ever been behind in the race. And at that point, I'm like, what's the point? 4 years of failure. And Thomas Hellriegel had a flat tire. It pulled up, and I just finished vomiting, just past Kauai High on the climb to Harvey again. And Thomas pulled up slowly next to me and said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm out. I'm done. I can't do this Ironman. I quit. I'm finished. He's like, yeah, but drink Coke. Like, you've had too much electrolyte. You're throwing it up. Just drink Coke and water. I'm like, no. And I remember thinking, well, I may as well follow him. I'm out here at Harvey. I've got to ride home anyway. I threw my drink bottles. At the next day, I just went Coke, water, and literally from that point on, did not have anything except Coke and water all the way back home. Delivered the fastest marathon of the day, ran myself into sixth position. And I remember being on the phone call with the Australian Institute of Sport after it. And they're like, yes, we're heading in the right direction. The nutrition thing, we got it right. You know, I'm like, dude, everything you told me to do, I followed. I felt crap. And the thing you told me not to do, I just followed the lead of a guy who's just bled out on this course for years, told me to drink Coke and water. And I got home, I've never felt so good. And that was when my takeaway from that was, look, I can conquer this course. Stop overthinking it from a nutrition perspective. You know, you put together a run. I was very nervous about my run, and I'm heading in the right direction now. And at that point, a sixth place finish, I was ecstatic to be up on that stage with the 10 champions. And Norman Stadler had won the year prior, and Farris won in 2005 when I felt sick. And I'd raced Farris in Roth and Norman the years prior. So I'm thinking, okay, I know I can get these guys. It's not a mystical Tim DeBoom or Peter Reed, who I didn't ever really race a lot. They become these mystical people that you don't feel like you know. I was always an athlete that felt like they had to know or have suffered with them to understand the type of character they were. And I believed at that point I could take those athletes on. It was really a changing of the guard, and these Germans and myself were heading in the right direction to be successful.
Yeah, and the next year you end up 71 seconds back in second place, and that begins the rivalry, right? You and Norman Stadler, because we were at the post party, and Norman said some stuff to Jay Pershun in Triathlete magazine, basically said Macca was drafting on the bike, and Ferris had told him. The next thing you know, you were on a mission to take this guy down.
Yeah, I'd never been. It was post 2005 when Faris won, and my whole team that I'd sort of worked with were always saying, because in ITU racing, I'd always back my run. I'd always been a runner.
Right.
And, but in Ironman racing, I was trying to be this biker off the front, going with Jürgen, going with Thomas. And because I was so scared of the marathon. I'd suffered so many indignities in these marathons that I just didn't have but from 2005 with this big run, I thought, you're the fastest runner in the field. Let's back the run. So in 2006, going into that race, you know, we all got out of the water together, Faris and myself. And Norman that year was the first ever year of the blue 70 speed suits. Mm-hmm. And Norman was the first person to ever have one. So for the first time in his career, he got out of the water with the front guy. We were still all swimming with our shirts tucked in. And full kudos to him. And he suddenly got out of the water with it. It was gone before we even saw him. But I was sitting there with Faris, the defending champion, thinking, I'm going to outrun Norman every day of the week. So literally, with the utmost respect to Norman, we felt if we could keep him within 10, he's always a 3 hour 2, 3 hour 3 marathon runner, 250 or better. I've got this guy. And so when I got off the bike, I ran away from the group behind me. And I honestly believed I was going to run Norman down. And he put together his best ever marathon that year, 255, which he'd never done before, and held me off. And I had never suffered as much to pursue a win because I was so close, and I've been so many years. And there it is. I could see Norman up the road. There's the win. I'm waiting for the music to kick in, but there it is. You know, Mark Allen had run past Thomas Hellriegel in the same position. You know, all these things had happened. They're all running through my head, and I couldn't get over the top of him. And I, to Norman's credit, and we're very close friends now, and I've told him this. I have so much respect. When you race somebody, you get to know their character. You know, all the public stuff, but you get to realize how tough of an individual they are. They're hard people, and you can't bluff that in an Ironman. You just can't bluff it. And you know, he was pushing and pushing, and as we crested Polani to come down the hill to turn with 2 kilometers to go, I was within 25 seconds of Norman at that point. And I know he looked back, and I was so close I could see his eyes, and I saw his teeth as he smiled. And that smile to me said, you know the history, mate. Whoever gets here first wins. I'm going downhill, you're going uphill, game over. The chase is over. You know, I win, you come second, it's over. And I immediately blew up. Like, I was immediately, all the energy was gone, and I was in survival mode, and I struggled and suffered and lost 40 seconds to him in the last 2 kilometers on the struggle home. But I crossed that finish line at 71. I've never been more content and happy with my performance ever, because I couldn't have given it any more. I was beaten by the better athlete on the day, and I'd finally delivered something in Kona that I could probably at that point in my career believed I could have lived with if that was my career, right?
Right.
And it was all, as you said, we went up on stage. It was pre-smartphones and everything. So I remember Norman had done an interview with Jay Prasad from Triathlete. And as we're up on the stage for the top 10, there was a guy called Ruth Kubicki who had been second the year prior. And he finished fourth this year. And it was Norman first, me second, Faris third, and Ruth Kubicki fourth. And as Norman, who's always the last person, the winner comes up last, and was shaking everybody's hand, I was within hearing distance of a conversation that he had with Rutger. And I heard him say, Rutger, I wish it was you that got a second. You deserve to outrun him today. You know, he was sitting in the group, right? He was sitting in the group, not doing much. But I'm thinking, it couldn't be me he's talking about, is it? And then him and Faris were quite, you know, and I understand why. You know, he'd won 1 year, Faris had won the next, and now he'd won. Yeah, you know, they're fighting over supremacy in their own country or recognition. And he got to me, and he just, as I went to shake his hand, he grabbed my shoulder and went, yeah, good race. And he did his thing, right? He did his speech. And I hadn't picked up on it, but I definitely felt attention. And as we walked off the stage, a guy called Becky Lavelle, Brian Lavelle and Brian Lavelle handed me a BlackBerry, the old BlackBerry phones. And he's like, have you read this article that Norman Stadler said about you? I'm like, no. You know, and I read this thing, and I erupted. Like, I just felt because I was so happy and I just felt the anger come from deep down inside me, right? Going, yeah, this guy attacked me. Like, I'm not enough. Like, I've raced you since we were kids. I'm not just some upstart that sat in a group and you still beat me. And so I hunted him out, looked for him. Spent the whole night, and I found him at the awards party, or the triathlon party, and rolled into that conversation. I walked up to him and said, "Look, could I have a chat with you about the interview you've just done?" And Norman, being the champion, and he had every right to be, said, "If you have anything to say, you say it to me here in front of everybody." And so I said, "Yeah, I've got something to say." And we had a verbal stoush, basically. And I said, "Look, you will never beat me again in your life. Yeah, you beat me fair and square yesterday." And he kept saying, "I've got 2 titles, you've got none. You're just a bag of hot air." I'm like, "That's it." I was so angry. And yeah, it became a war of words that tippled over into a very personal, which is what I've realized in a reflective state is what I actually needed. Yep. I need to drive whatever that reason is to be out in those lava fields and suffer. You need something to grab onto when you're asking yourself those questions. And for me, it was always about a rivalry or needing to prove something. And that was basically the red flag that I needed to set about that 2007 year that culminated in that Kona win.
Yeah. And so coming back and winning in 2007 after getting so close in 2006 and having so many attempts from 2002 on, now all of a sudden you've got the win. How did that change things for you? How did that change the sort of the destination of your career, finally getting to the mountaintop?
It was I can contrast them between the two, because 2007 for me was as much as a relief because of the Norman. Yes. I remember my wife saying to me, in the lead up to Kona, "You need to calm down. Like this, if you don't win this, you're coming off a little bit like a jerk, right? Like, you better win, because if you don't, you're done." And so there was a relief around that. There was a real relief around finally doing it. Like on my mother's deathbed, I said to her I wanted to win the Olympics and I was going to win the Hawaiian Ironman. And I tell a story. It's true. The first triathlon I ever watched was the 1987 Ironman in Hawaii when Dave Scott runs around the car to beat Mark Allen.
Yep.
And I said to my brothers that day, "I'm going to do that race one day." And they all laughed. They're like, "Oh, you're kidding. You're fat, like you're hopeless." Right? And so for me, all these funny things that run through your head, and I remember that. And my best friend, Sean Moroney, who died in 2002, we were both supposed to debut in Kona together. There has never been bigger geeks of triathlon than us two. We were fanatical geeks. Like we lived through the magazines, we watched movies, we just wanted to be in Kona. And to think I'm now a Greg Welsh, like I'm an Australian winner of the greatest race on the planet, and I've done it. Like it's no longer a dream; it's going to happen. It was bigger than the feeling was bigger than you can ever imagine. It was magnificent, and I don't remember the last 2 miles of that run. Like I was celebrating, like before Palani Hill down when I knew I had it won. And I try a few times now. I got older. I'm like, what was it like? I remember 2010 vividly, but 2007 was like a blur because there was so much emotion attached to it and so much reason in the background that I needed that. And it was satisfying personally, satisfying professionally, but it just what it meant to two dreamers, in myself and Sean Moran. And that's all we were. We were little rat bag kids that just looked up to Mark Allen and Dave Scott and Paulie Curio and Greg Welsh and thought they were superhumans. And to finally enter that superhuman club and be able to, I guess, like the golfers do, get to wear that jacket and be a champion of this race that meant so much to us. It was just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Was Sean in your mind as you came down to let you drive?
As I crossed the finish line, my mum and Sean, I'll never forget it. I crossed the line. I said, "I love you both." And I point to the sky, and I didn't zip up, Bob.
I know you had those 2 sponges.
I had these 2 sponges, and that's how much it meant. Usually you're thinking like a professional athlete, but to me, it was at that point, I wasn't an athlete. I was a young kid who all he ever wanted was, I watched every race of that race,
Yeah.
And I'm like, my God, I am an Ironman Hawaii winner. I am Mark Allen, with the utmost respect. But
yeah.
I'm in the club. Can you believe it? We did it, and it was a we. It was definitely a we moment, and Sean was a big part of that we, because he drove. You need a reason to suffer, and if you listen to Mark Allen, Dave Scott, anyone who's Jan Frodeno, any of the athletes, there has to be some fundamental reason why you want to do this. Now, why you want to run out of the energy lab and suffer, and especially when you're trying to win the event. And for me, it was an absolute love and appreciation and respect for the great champions that came, and me wanting to emulate them so much that it shaped my character to some degree, and because I wanted to be them. And that at that point, I no longer had to pretend. I could actually be, if that makes sense. I could actually be an Ironman champion as opposed to pretending to be one or wanting to be one.
So then in 08, 09, you didn't 1 year drop out, and another year fourth, and then you come back 2010. At that point, people were counting you out, which is playing right into your wheelhouse, right? You like it when people count you out. Crowe has won the race 2 years in a row. Great formula, top swimmer, strong on the bike. But you knew that if you guys attack between Kauai High, Hawaii, and Kauai High into the crosswinds, that potentially you can get a gap. But you needed help, right? You couldn't do it without Ferris, without the other guys who were, Timo Brock, without the other great cyclists. You needed that gap so that Crowe wouldn't win 3 in a row. And that's what happened, right? All of a sudden, you've got that lead. When you're on the marathon, when did you start hearing that Andreas Raelert is flying? And I always think about you as a chess player. You're the guy out there who's playing this as it goes. And a lot of people would panic and try to run too hard. You knew he was going to catch you. And talk us through how you played it out to win that second title.
Yeah, well, obviously 2008, 2009, Craig Alexander dominated, and in my career as an Ironman racer in Kona, he's the best I ever raced. He's incredible in hot weather.
Yes,
he's always going to be there. He's a meticulous trainer. He doesn't over race. He's very strategic in his planning for a season. So he used to stay in the States. He never left and went to Europe. He controlled everything in his world, and it's hard for an athlete to admit, but you come up against multiple people in your career where you just have to admit that you at your best is not good enough to beat them, right? And I had that with Simon Lessing. I had it with Simon Whitfield. And I used to have it with a guy called Paul Amy, where I believed at my best and their best, they win. And I believed in a shootout with Craig Alexander on the run, especially in a place like Kona, where the world's best are there and all these gaps are closed. He's gonna outrun me. So. And he played this formula in 2008, winning on the run. He played the formula again in 2009. And what I'd realized with Kona, and you still see it to this day, and except it becomes more of a common conversation now. At that point, no one had really understood the pack dynamic to some degree. It wasn't really talked about, but now it's common. I'd realized that if you get away from Crowe, the problem was if you have Marino van Oenacker and Andy Raelert and Timo Brock and even Luke McKenzie and all these athletes that close gaps, as a big runner, you don't actually have to do the work. Legally, you know those gaps are going to be closed. So my whole theory going in was, look, guys, instead of fighting against each other, when I go up the road, you closing the gap and bringing the group with me, treat it like a bike race, attack. Let's keep the pressure on between Kauai High, Harvey and Kauai High, where we get the crosswinds, where everyone really has to do their own work. If the gap goes up the road and you're looking over your shoulder for someone else to close the gap, if no one's going to close it, you've got to close it yourself. And I don't believe the guys that are using SRMs, and that was the beginning of SRMs coming in with Crowe riding off power at that point. I don't believe they're going to spike their power at that point, and we can get the gap. And if I've got all the heavy riding artillery up front, we just got to ride the normal pace, and no one's going to close the gap. That gap's going to blow out. And we called it in February in Austin at the university.
Yes, we did.
In Auburn. And it's sort of what happened. And coming into town, we got rid of Nico Lanos and Crowe and this group of runners I was semi-concerned about. And at that point, I was reflecting on who was in this group I had to worry about. I had Norman in the group. I had Faris in the group. But the main concern was Andy Raelert, who had just beaten us up in Ironman Frankfurt in July. Like he just destroyed us. And I positioned myself behind him. I was watching him going in, and he sort of struggled about 30 kilometers out from town, which is the scenic lookout. I saw him out of the saddle a little bit and struggling. So I got on really, really well with the South African Reynard Tissink. He was a guy I used to race in Europe as juniors with. And I was fortunate enough to be floating back through the pack after watching Andy. And I said to Reynard, I'm going. Do you want to come with me? He's like, oh, I'm in. And that's the great thing about it. He's just a warrior. And we attacked and we got a break. It was the margin of error that I wanted over Andy. And I wanted to play the same game I played in 07 against the Tim de Booms, and that was run out of town at a winner's tempo, be the alpha male on this course. When they see you coming back, you're in absolute control. You're no longer the guy that's blown up. You're a champion of this sport. Crowie, who we've all worried about in the past, is no longer on anyone's brain, which is important, because now they're not worrying where Crowie is because they've got the 10-minute gap. They're looking at the win. So when you're looking at a win, I'd been in that position. You make many mistakes, lots of them, because you get anxious. You start thinking too far ahead of the play, and you make stupid errors. And so I pushed out, and by about 10 miles, I was still at a minute to Andy, but it started to come back. And so in years past, I'd learned that you don't need to push. You only need to be first across the line. You don't need to be first coming out of the energy lab, because I've been that many times and still not finished, right? At all. It's first back to town that wins. So I made a conscious decision to relax, to take the pressure off mentally of pushing, accept that Andy may catch me. And there's nothing wrong with that. At least at that point, he's around me. I can see him. I can see what he's doing. I can control at least the outcome at that point. And I sort of done the math in my head, realizing I was losing 10 to 15 seconds a mile, and thought he would catch me with about 10 kilometers to go, because the math said if he can continue at the same pace. And with 10 kilometers to go coming out of the energy lab, he still hadn't caught me. So you start to look for these little positives, because you're emotionally and physically drained. And for me, that was a big positive, saying, well, he is human. I know what we saw in July was superhuman, but this is human, and he's probably struggling. So continue to get the food in, continue to hydrate, and be ready for this onslaught. And it took him another 5 kilometers to catch me, which was about 6 kilometers from the finish. And I made a conscious decision at that point to never let him actually make a pass, to keep him, to be the alpha male like Simon Lessing was to me. And I realized the power of that position with people. Like it's a subconscious power that you don't realize. And Mark Allen talks about it a lot too. It's this energy you have when you be that person to the other individual. They succumb, whether they succumb physically, they do succumb at some point in their head. And at that point, I realized he was struggling, and I realized he was human, and I realized I can win this thing. It's if I play this correctly and I time this right, I can win it. But it's not a foregone conclusion. I made a squeeze on the Macca Dave Hill, and I got a bit of a gap on him. I panicked a little bit, thinking it's too early. Don't blow this. You're still a long way from home with 2 kilometers to go. I allowed him to close the gap again. And I knew he had to work to do that. And every bit of energy you put out at that point of a race you're going to pay for it at some point. And that's what happened with me with Norman in 06, where I lost so much time in the last 2 kilometers. And as we crested, we went down the hill with 2 kilometers to go. I had this plan that I was going to sprint from the oak, the big tree, the banyan tree, because Terenzo Bozzoni and myself have been practicing this in training every single week. So I planned, look, once I hit that banyan tree, let's go for it. 63 seconds from there to the finish line. Yeah, like you can do it. And suddenly I heard him calling for Coke and water and ice, and there seemed to be a bit of desperation to his need
his
to
tone,
get this.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, his tone. And I remember thinking, wow, you're going to go get Coke and water. We're racing for a world championship here, and you're thinking of Coke and water? Like, no problems, pal. Like, and as he sort of came in towards the aid station, I positioned myself in front of him, and I thought, once he goes out to get that Coke and water, I'm going to take the 2 other water, because they're holding them. I'm going to take the 2 other pieces. So he's going to have to go deeper into that aid station to find someone else who's going to hand him off the water, because I've taken the 2 low-hanging fruit of water that was hanging there. And once he went in, I just went bang, and the gap opened really, really rapidly. And I had a sneaky glance as he made the left at the bottom of Palani, and I saw I probably had 50 or 60 meters on him. And at that point, he was still committed to the chase. And I really dug along that flat section, which is a very, very difficult part when you come off the downhill and you've got the leg speed at the end of Kona, and you've got to really work that flat section before the right hander. It's still a good kilometer of running. Your legs are dead, you're tired. And I knew if I could work that section, it'd be good. And I was too scared to look around. You've got age groupers coming everywhere. And I had Eric Gilson on the motorbike. And I said to him, Eric, can you see him? Can you see Andy? Because I was in agony, like I was getting stiff. And he said to me, Chris, you know the rules. I'm not allowed to tell you that he's nowhere in sight. And I was like, I'm like, oh. And that was when I realized I had it. And literally, look, I remember every step. For me, that's my Kona win, not because of the way it went down, but for me, that 07 year, I was so lost in the emotion of what it was to me as an individual. That year was me as a racer. I was like, mate, I'm a professional triathlete. The year before, I'm a dreamer. Or the 2007 year, I was a dreamer and an aspiring. All I ever wanted was that. It was a completely different feeling, and I rejoiced the entire way. I'm as clear as day. I remember every step. I remember faces in the crowd. I remember thinking of the family, the kids. I remember it was just about, we did it. The whole world said we couldn't. I told you it was possible. I knew we could do it, and it's not a changing of the guard. It's mine, and I've now got it. And it was beautiful, a beautiful win.
So what I love is your passion for the sport has taken you to, you were Tanya Porta creating training programs there, and then the Bahrain and 13 endurance team, and now with Super League. And talk a little bit about that, because obviously this is back to your roots. This is back to, the Uncle Toby's and all the racing on Australia, where you guys are doing swim, bike, run, 20, 30-minute races. There's high intensity, full adrenaline. Talk a little about Super League and just where you see it going.
Yeah, well, for me, post that 2010 year, I had a midlife crisis, as my wife calls it, and I tried to make the Olympics, right? So It was, and so I had the opportunity to be part of or experience the Brownlee brothers and this amazing new generation of stars that had taken that ITU racing that we'd done and just
another level,
take it to another 3 or 4 levels. So to be a part of that and to see that was amazing. And I was a lot more content as an individual from a professional racing career, and I didn't feel this need to prove anything anymore. I could happily box my career up and say, I can live with that for the rest of my life, and I'm happy. And so I was always, I think every athlete does, was always looking at the other, what are you going to do after your career? And I didn't want to be a coach, a cliche coach to some degree. I wanted to move into a different role, into some role where I could use my brain a little bit more and bring change. And so I took a role in Thanyapura in Thailand, and we built a big training facility there. We had the backing of a billionaire German philanthropist, and I was able to I guess sink my teeth into something else outside of swimming, biking, running. So I was able to transition, but fill my brain with keep myself occupied and solve problems. And I think the big takeaway for me that I took from my career and was able to migrate into this business world quite effectively was, I'm a problem solver at heart. I'm an accountant. And I was a problem solver in triathlon. It just happened to be swimming, biking, running, or Craig Alexander, or Simon Lessing, or Norman Stadler. I need to solve a problem. I need to work on things. And I actually thoroughly enjoy that process. That's, that's what I learned when I left triathlon. When you move away from the light, the fame, but what you think it is, and you start to really break down what it is to you as an individual. It was the solving of problems. And Thanyapura enabled me to create a network and solve problems and build this center. And then I started looking at the sport. I was like, what do I actually love? What do I actually love outside of being a competitor? I still follow triathlon. I still sit up in watching Ironman Hawaii or watching the 70.3 Worlds all night. I watch it because I actually enjoy it. And I thought, well, why don't I try and bring change to the sport? And I had an opportunity to meet with the Royal Family Bahrain, and we created the Bahrain Endurance 13 team, and we created the cycling team, and then I wanted to do something for the amateur athlete, the younger professional athletes. And my most, enjoyable years of racing was in Australia with Greg Welsh and Brad Bevan in these super sprint races that we had down here, which are, where swimming, biking, and running are all done at a similar amount of time. 300 meters of swimming takes 4 minutes. 5 kilometers of biking takes 5 minutes. And 1 mile of running takes 4 or 5 minutes. So every discipline is relatively even. And we just make athletes do them more and more times. And you find out who, in theory, technically is the best multi-sport athlete who can do those 3 disciplines better than anyone else. So, yeah, we sort of, blueprinted a formula on what Super League racing could be if I could launch it around the world. And I sat down with the guys, the Bray brothers that did the old Australian version. Yeah. And asked them what they tried to launch International
Triathlon Grand Prix. Yeah.
Yes. And they were met with a lot of obstacles. And unfortunately it failed. And they gave me basically not a blueprint, but here's some of the problems you're going to face. And like I said, I was like, okay, fantastic. Here's the ITU problem. And we sat there and there was a funding issue. And so once I went out and raised the capital and I put the team in place, like I did in triathlon with Michael Dulce, my CEO and business partner, and Leonid, who is the main primary investor, and building our teams out in London and Singapore, we launched with Super League. And my aim was to create a professional platform for professionals to be professional, to make and earn, but to put them in front of a larger audience.
Right.
And for the way to target a younger, and I mean this with the utmost respect to Ironman,
it's a younger demographic, no question.
A much younger demographic. I wanted these young athletes to influence a 15, a 16-year-old, like I was influenced by Greg Welsh. And yeah, Greg Welsh's performances in Ironman did that, but it was also the ability to see him
every week on TV.
Exactly. And that was how we launched with it, and we did a test event in Hamilton Island, which was a big success. And then we did another event in Jersey almost 4 years ago now, a men's and women's race. And boom, the rest is history. We sort of
love it.
Yeah, a lot of people liked what we're doing, and we kept the athletes involved in the decision making. We put the money up, and we rolled out with it. And it's been an initiation in this mergers and acquisitions and all these words that I used to hear all the big bankers talk about. I guess nowadays I'm on the other side, and I get to be part of a lot of those conversations and a lot of what goes on behind the scenes to own things, to deliver things, to fund things, to make them viable, that you never really consider as an athlete. You just think it's just going to be there. It's just going to be there. Yeah. So it's been amazing. I've enjoyed this as much as the racing, and I realize I'm a bit of a deal maker, as Leonid says. You're in mergers and acquisitions, Chris. You're not a deal maker. You build a strategy.
M&A, baby.
Yeah. Right. So it's been great.
Love it. Macca, thanks for taking so much time, man. Sorry to take so much of your time. Anytime I get to chat with you, it's always such a treat to get to talk.
Oh, too easy. No problems at all. It's been enjoyable to talk to someone. We're in lockdown here in Sydney, so it's great to chat.
Oh, yeah, wait a second.
Oh, look at that.
How about that,
That's 10 years old. Yeah, that's 10 years old, and you can have it for breakfast tomorrow.
I know, right? That stuff lasts forever. Yeah. Chris McCormack has been our guest. Again, we're brought to you by the PTO, the Pro Triathletes Organization, by Amp Human, VeloFix, Normatec Form Goggles, You Can, and our Challenged Athletes Foundation. Macca, you're the best, buddy. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob.
Stay healthy. Hi to the family.
Will do. Send love to everyone in the US.
All right,
Take
brother.
care.
Bye.
Bye.